I'm delighted to be here at MIDS as a visiting fellow this past week, and hope to be back here for a little while more early next year. And really grateful to all of you for having braved the rains and such like things to listen to this lecture today. So in the next hour or so, I really want to take you back to India in the 1940s. But my starting point for what is going to follow really is about asking questions which are really a contemporary concern. So this year we've seen the 25th anniversary of India's liberalization of the economy happening. And those of you who've been reading the press might be forgiven for assuming that literally everything that is visible in India today somehow is an outcome of a set of decisions taken in those momentous weeks in the summer of 1991. And in particular, when we think about India's place in the world and the way that India is perceived today as a major emerging economy, as an Asian power of some standing, the assumption is that all of this is just a consequence of what has happened in the last 25 years or so. And historians are good at suggesting only two things. First, that everything began much earlier, and second, that everything is more complicated than you think, right? So I'm going to try and do a bit of both to tell you a story about India during the Second World War, which I really do believe was a catalytic moment for India's emergence onto the international stage as an Asian power. And I'd like to suggest today that we have to think about India's rise on the Asian stage and, of course, the global stage as a long phenomenon, which is still continuing in some ways, but which has, as a plausible starting point, India's role in the Second World War. I also have a sort of a secondary agenda as a historian, which is to try and get us to think about the 1940s in somewhat different ways from the way we've been thinking about it. Standard textbook histories of India during this period will begin with the sort of starting of the war in September 1939, when the Viceroy of India took India to war without consulting any Indians. Very quickly, you have the resignation of the various Congress ministries. Fast forward to 1942, you have the Cripps mission, which comes to negotiate a constitutional settlement for India, which fails. And summer of 1942, you have the Great Quit India movement kicking in. The Congress leadership is put into jail. And then when the war ends, you begin the sort of long, protracted negotiations towards independence, which comes with partition, right? So that is the broad story that we know of the 1940s. But what the story leaves out, or puts very much into the deep background, really is the fact that there was a cataclysmic world war happening at this point of time, in which India was very much caught up, and in which India's role, contribution was significant, and which impacted upon India very significantly as well. So the second sort of agenda for this evening really is to tell you a story of the 1940s, which might be quite unfamiliar from the standard narratives of the march towards freedom and partition that we are accustomed to talking about. So let's begin with India being drawn into the war in September 1939 by the announcement of the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, that India was at war because Britain was at war, right? And Linlithgow did not consult any nationalist or Indian opinion of any stripe in making that very momentous decision. And that had all kinds of political consequences, which we are more or less familiar with. But what I want to focus on is how this decision played out in enabling India to develop and transform its military power, to become an economy of a very different kind from what it was at that point of time, and to acquire an international profile which it did not quite have before the war. So the first thing that happens as a result of the decision to take India to war is a tremendous expansion of the Indian armed forces. So the chart here, if you follow the blue line, basically tells you that the Indian army went from being about just short of 200,000 in September 1939 to being something close to 2.5 million by 1945, right? So this extraordinary expansion of the Indian army is the first and most noteworthy fact of it. The second thing is that the Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy both literally come into being during the war. I mean, they exist as very nascent services before that, but it's during the war that you come. So if you sort of take into account the total mobilization of military manpower in India during this period, it's about 2.5 million men in uniform, and they were men, unfortunately. So the key thing, however, is not just the numbers of it, right? The pre-war Indian army, about 200,000 or so, was recruited from very select communities in India. They were known as the martial classes. And these martial classes were basically groups which were concentrated in the northwest of India. And when we're talking about northwest of India, undivided India, so Pakistan included, right? So which were those communities? From the Punjab, which was the main sort of heartland of military recruitment in undivided India, you had two major groups, the Punjabi Jat Sikhs, as they used to be called, the yeoman peasantry, and you had the Punjabi Musalman, or the Punjabi Muslims. These were the two main communities which were the backbone of the pre-war Indian army. On top of this, you had groups like the Rajputs from Western India, Jats, again from Northwestern India, Gurkhas from Nepal, right? So predominantly, these were the communities which accounted for the bulk of the 200,000 men who came into the Indian army in 1939. But when you are talking about expanding an army of this size to becoming something close to 2.5 million in a span of about 3 years, which is when the recruitment really starts ramping up, then it's no longer possible to hold on to the same social composition of the Indian army, right? So the whole sort of idea that there are only certain groups in India which are capable of bearing arms or fighting has to be thrown out of the window. So the martial races theory is more or less overturned. And what you have is a extraordinary sort of expansion of the recruitment basis of the Indian army, right? And the one group which contributed maximum to the new recruits into the Indian army, and group from which nobody was recruiting prior to this, was of course from south of India, right? So the people who came from the 4 southern states of today really were accounted for a very large proportion of the increase between 200,000 to 2.5 million. The second thing which happened was that groups which are kind of marginal to Indian caste system, right? So the backward castes, the Dalits, and the tribals also contributed in significantly large numbers to this increasing involvement. That was partly because the British were averse to attracting upper caste groups, particularly in North India, which were all seen as being very pro-Congress, which was of course opposed to the war. So you wanted to create an army which they believed would be somehow reliable and loyal to them over the course of these 5 years. And so you created an army which was much more diversified both in its regional composition as well as its social caste composition, right? So the Indian army which you landed up with during the Second World War is actually much closer to the Indian army that we have today. And this is a point I'll come back to a little later. The second important thing is about the ratio of British officers to Indian officers in the Indian army. The pre-war Indian army was predominantly officered by the British. It's only from 1917 onwards, after the First World War, that the British allowed Indian officers to sort of command troops in the Indian army. And again, just like the expansion of the army means that you have to overthrow previous theories about which rules are capable of fighting, you have to now willy-nilly accept that Indians are capable of leading troops as well. So your ratio of British to Indian officers in every unit of the Indian army goes from being something like 10 to 1 to being 4 to 1. This is a very important development because it means that when independence comes, and it comes just 2 years after the end of the war, you have an officer class in India which is actually capable of taking control of the Indian army. It's an important thing because if you look at something like the Indian Navy, which as I said is a service which came into being practically during the war, the Indian Navy did not have its first Indian Chief of Naval Staff until 1956. It was officered by British officers until almost a decade after independence, right? So with the army, we did not have that situation, partly because of this changing composition. Okay, so how do we think about the strategic role of British India during the Second World War? So one easy way of thinking about it is to say that British India was basically an appendage of the British Empire, the Raj is a cog in a larger imperial machinery, and that India had to do basically what Britain wanted it to do. But that is a very partial and somewhat misleading picture of what India's position really was. Because British India was widely acknowledged to be something like a sub-imperial system of its own. There was something which historians call the Empire of the Raj, right? And this British sub-imperial system really had a set of buffer zones which were there to protect India's security. And the two most important of these were Afghanistan and Tibet. You had military commitments by the Indian army to the Middle East as well as Southeast Asia. You had commercial interests by Indian capitalists in places like Malaya, Burma, Afghanistan, East Africa, right? And you also had significant amount of outward migration from India to various parts of the sub-imperial system. Between 1830 and 1930, some 30 million Indians emigrated from the subcontinent to these various other parts. And in many places, they were the ones who built, cities like Dar es Salaam, Singapore, etc. All of them were built on Indian labor, and Indian capital had a very important role to play. So in many ways, India had this sort of pre-assigned role of providing security to this entire region, this entire arc which surrounded India. And in many ways, it was these places where the Indian army found itself fighting the early stages of the war. So the first, of course, were the campaigns which the Indian army was pulled into in late 1939, early 1940, in Africa, and predominantly in North Africa. And North Africa was a theater where the Indian army was engaged from the very first sort of battles with the Italians, subsequently with the Germans under Rommel, right up to 1943. And thereafter, the Indian army took part in the campaign to sort of reconquer Italy, and then fought until the end of the war in Europe. Equally important was the Indian army's role in East Africa. And here you have a war artist's impression of Indian troops entering the city of Keren in East Africa, which was captured entirely by the 4th Division of the Indian Army. And in both of these campaigns, in North and East Africa, the Indian Army had a very important, not to say crucial role. Then there were campaigns in the Middle East. The Indian Army was, for the period between 1941 to the end of the war, in charge of occupying all of Iraq, very large parts of Syria, and southern Iran as well. All of these, in fact, many areas which you read about in the news today, about campaigns against IS, etc., were actually under the occupation of the Indian army throughout this period, right? So India was responsible for providing security to this entire area. And of course, all of this was partly because of oil. The main British oil fields, British-owned oil fields jointly with the Iranians, used to be in south of Iran, and the port of Basra in southern Iraq was the main avenue from which oil used to be shipped out. So the Indian army was called upon to perform these roles. What the Indian army did not, however, expect to do, nor did many people in India, was actually to end up fighting the Japanese. So one of the very interesting things is how certain kinds of ideas get fixated in the minds of strategic planners, right? They are, I think as a community, amongst the lot of people who are slowest on the uptake to change their fundamental assumptions. So one of the fundamental ingrained assumptions of people who ruled the British Raj from the early 19th century onwards was that somebody, possibly the Russians, will come through Afghanistan and attack India. And that was an assumption which had startlingly long life. As late as 1943, every fortnightly report sent by the Viceroy of India to the British government used to begin with a description of the situation in Afghanistan, right? So it's almost as if that was the main thing, but it was not. Not only was the Indian army fighting in North and East Africa, in the Middle East, but the Japanese were very quickly getting their act together. And when the Japanese attack in Southeast Asia begins, at the same time that they attack Pearl Harbor, very quickly the Indian army, which is present in Malaya and in Singapore, is booted out. More damagingly, the Indian army has to retreat from Burma, where the Japanese managed to sort of push Indians right back to the northeastern borders with Assam. And it's really from this point, the summer of 1942, that India's war begins, because it is now that the war has come really to India's gates. Till this point of time, the Indians were fighting in very faraway theaters. Now you have to prepare to fight very close to the Indian subcontinent itself, and it is in this context that India's war effort really starts kicking in. So the first thing you have to do if you want to fight a modern industrial war like the Second World War is to build a war economy, right? And the Indian economy had very little wherewithal to do this. Indian war industry before 1940 is practically non-existent. You have all of 6 ordnance factories, and there is no private armaments industry in India. There is very limited production of steel or aluminium. There are no heavy chemicals, no automobiles, no aircraft, no shipping. None of this stuff is produced, manufactured in India before 1940, right? But the war really means that you need to start gearing your economy to start producing. And if you just see the growth on India's GDP during this period, it shows a certain interesting trend, which is that the period from 1941-42 onwards, there is a significant uptick in the overall output of the Indian economy, right? So the economy really starts kicking into shape once the Japanese reach close to Burma, forcing India to then do this. But what this overall sort of growth in the Indian economy does not really tell us is how it was achieved. And that really is the interesting story. The first important part about this was that this expansion in India's economic production was led by the government of India, right? Now the government of India, the British Raj, is at least used to think of itself as the classic laissez-faire 19th century night watchman state, whose only job was to provide law and order and enforce contracts, right? The government's business is not to do anything with the economy. But the Second World War compels the government of India really to start intervening in the Indian economy in order to produce for the war effort. Let's also remember that by the time the Japanese have come into Burma and put India on the back foot, most of your shipping lanes to India through the Suez Canal, Red Sea, etc. are all closed, right? So the quantity of stuff that you can import from either Britain or America, all of that is very limited. So you have to start producing stuff at home. So the first things that the government of India does is to appoint an Indian supply member to look after the overall effort of the war economy. So the supply department of the government of India used to be the main agency which was coordinating all of this function. Then in the second stage, you start revving up production. This happens by ensuring greater coordination between various departments of the government of India which are involved in the war effort. For the first time, by 1943, you have an industrial planning organization which comes into being. And the whole idea that the government has to plan for the economy to produce in certain ways is actually comes into operation for the very first time. And this has longer term institutional consequences. The Indian government, which is the British government of India, always had an arm's length distance kind of relationship with Indian capitalists, which is why Indian capitalists got together in 1927 to establish the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FICCI. It was established as a forum for nationalist Indian capitalists to be able to sort of act together. But the war really forces the government of India to develop closer relations with industry. So a lot of Indians are bought into advisory committees to advise about how various war activities could be done. And this leads to a series of steps like providing raw materials at controlled prices. You talk about standardization of products, information asymmetries between producers and consumers of various kinds of products are reduced. Much later, Rajaji would say that the British Raj had gone, but India had a license, permit, quota Raj. Every element of this, licenses, permits, and quotas, actually came into being during the Second World War. In fact, the post-independence government of India wholesale adopted legislation from the wartime for each of these things and carried it over into independent India's planning process. Right? So the war really sets the template for how the economy is to be managed. And then you have increased production in the military sphere of a very considerably sort of improved magnitude, very impressive numbers of various kinds of things produced. Especially note the number of armored vehicles, right? You're producing nothing. No tanks were being produced in India before 1939. But by the end of the war, you are rolling that stuff out of your factories. Government support for private industry becomes quite important during this period. At least 160 private factories are either inaugurated or expanded using government-supported capital, right? And this includes certain very iconic sort of brands in post-independence India, like Larsen and Toubro is a sort of a conglomerate which is quite big in India today, but which got its first breaks in wartime contracts. The Kirloskars are another example. You can think about, say, other brands like Bata, which was again a leather factory which was supported by the government of India at that point of time. What the government did was both to give capital and also to promise protection in the post-war scenario, right? Because if you are a capitalist, you are going to invest all this stuff today. When the war ends, when the demand slumps, are we going to sort of open up the markets and allow foreign competition to swamp you? The government said we won't do it. Now, what this effectively meant was that you were following a policy which economists in the 1950s and 60s would call import substitution industrialization. Basically, because you could not import all of this stuff, you needed this. You were industrializing by the government taking the lead and using various techniques of production. And all of this was reflected in increased industrial output. You were starting to produce things in larger quantities and producing things which you were not producing, like heavy chemicals, for instance. Machine tools. Machine tools are machines which make machines, very important for any industrial economy, came into India primarily during the Second World War. And the quality as well as quantity of the various things that were being produced really saw a significant uptick. And you had a number of very interesting success stories amongst Indian sort of capitalists and Indian industrialists. Here you have Delhi Cloth Mills, the DCM group, led by Lala Sriram, which had a 7-fold increase in net profit during the war period, made a killing because India was literally clothing every soldier of allied armies across the world. Yeah, the creation of military uniforms was one of the major things that we were doing. The operating profit margin of the group. Now, operating profit margin is basically how much does a company make for every rupee that it's of goods that it manufactures and sells, right? The operating profit margin of this significant leap during this period. In fact, I believe this number is somewhat understated because we don't have the exact data. Take a look at what was happening with the Kasturbhai group of mills in Ahmedabad, right? The operating profit margin actually goes up to 38, almost 39% by 1943, and then slumps towards the end of the war as wartime demand is coming down, right? So certain categories of Indian industrialists really did very, very well out of the war. But the Indian economy as a whole had a problem, which is that you had to find the money to finance this war, right? Now, a lot of this money was stuff that was actually paid out by the government of India on behalf of Britain, right? Because we were doing all these commitments, fighting in North Africa, East Africa, occupying the Middle East, doing various things, partly because of British commitments, not necessarily because of India's direct commitments, right? So if you look at this chart, what it tells you is the amount of money that the British government owned to the government of India as the war progressed, right? And this money was basically being created. There was a Government of India account opened in London, where the British government used to deposit treasury securities or IOUs, saying that this is money that is accruing in the credit of the government of India. At some point, this money can be taken out by the government of India. And if you look at the numbers, by the end of the war in 1945, the British government owns the government of India 1.3 billion pounds. 1.3 billion pounds in 1945 is the equivalent of 300 billion US dollars today, right? And that is the amount of foreign exchange reserves the RBI has today. It's an extraordinary sort of amount of foreign exchange for a poor economy like India to accumulate. Now, the fact, however, was that all of this money was not being given to India in real time. In real time, it was India which had to find the financial resources to pay for the war. And there are only three ways to pay for any war. You can raise money by taxation, you can borrow on the capital markets, or you can print money, right? And the interesting thing is that the government of India ended up doing each of these three things almost equally. About a third of your money came out of taxes because India's tax base was abysmally low. The number of people paying direct or income taxes by 1945 was a figure like 400,000. Now, it's an incredibly low number. We are still doing very poorly on that count, but things were much worse at that point of time. Taxes also were not that forthcoming because indirect taxes were coming down because imports were coming down, right? So you couldn't simply raise that kind of revenue. The second thing was about borrowing money. So the government of India floated a number of war bonds at about 3% interest, but there was very little uptake. And as you can see, only about another third of the overall requirement came out of the capital markets. And this was partly because of politics. Most Indians were not willing to bankroll the British war effort because the Congress party and its leaders were in jail, right? So there was almost a capital strike undertaken by Indians refusing to bankroll the war effort, which meant that the government of India and the Reserve Bank had no option but to start printing an extraordinary amount of currency, right? So if you look at this chart, it tells you what is the number of notes in circulation during this period. And as you can see, from 1941-42, there is a sharp uptick in the amount of money that is in circulation. Now, when you have this much of money in circulation, what you get is inflation, right? So Milton Friedman is supposed to have said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now, I don't know about that, but at least in the Second World War in India, very much a monetary phenomenon, right? And again, if you see this chart, the rise in inflation tracks the increase in notes in circulation quite closely. Now, the consequences of this were something that the Indian economy had to really come to terms with. And it hit both urban and rural India in almost equal measure, right? So here you have a sample study done in Bombay in 1944, which talks about aggregate household income of middle class, which they defined in certain ways, going up by about 45% during the war period. Yeah, so the economy is expanding, people are making more money. But at the same time, expenditure on food as a category of expenditure for the household is almost doubling during this period, right? So people are making more money, but they also have to spend a lot more on food. And you have a reduction in consumption of practically every kind of food product, starting from vegetables to milk to sugar to butter to meat. Yeah. And in rural India, things were really bad, at least in certain places. We all know about the Great Bengal Famine of 1943-44, which is perhaps the best known of the sort of various kinds of problems that came up during the war. An estimated 3 million people might have died in the Bengal famine. Now, the causes of that famine are quite hotly debated even till date. But what I want to suggest here is that the Bengal famine is only the extreme end of a spectrum of deprivation that hit India during this period. Let's take a few examples, right? Here is a letter written by the wife of a soldier from Madras Presidency. We don't know exactly where she was writing from, but from Madras Presidency, who says that death and death everywhere, starvation and epidemics sweep away daily a good number. Famine camps were established in Madras Presidency already by late 1942. And Madras Presidency was one of the first presidencies to actually respond to this thing. And these camps were, at their height, feeding up to 300,000 people, giving them some kind of famine works employment and making sure that they had access to food. In the Bombay Presidency, this is from a report written by the district commissioner of the Karnataka districts, which are the sort of southern districts of the old undivided Bombay Presidency and northern districts of Karnataka today. Who says that we now are faced with the problem of how to tackle mass hunger on a menacing scale. Here you have a letter written by the father of a soldier who was serving in the Hyderabad State Forces in North Africa, and he says, "I am too helpless to make both ends meet. Prices have risen, double, triple, quadruple." Right? This is what happens when you have runaway hyperinflation. United Provinces, further up. Again, another father writing to his son, "Scarcity and death is ranging through the land. People are returning empty-handed from the shops all the time." And this is not just about British India. We talked about Hyderabad. Take another princely state, Travancore. Now, Travancore is supposed to be one of the more enlightened, well-administered states. Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer is the Diwan of Travancore. But very few of us know that Travancore actually saw the second largest famine in India during the Second World War after the Bengal famine. Here is a letter written by a wife of a soldier who was serving in East Africa from Travancore, who says that men, women, and children with no flesh on their bones, all skeletons, just as if they were half dead. And there are a number of letters like this that can be found. Now, just to give you a scale of a sense of scale of what is happening in Travancore, the Bengal famine, the best demographic evidence suggests that maybe some 56 people per 1,000 of the population was the number of excess deaths over and above normal mortality, right? So you can say that about 56 people you could identify per 1,000 as having died primarily due to causes related to the famine and war effort. In the case of Travancore, which is a much smaller province, a much smaller state in terms of population, the numbers of excess death or excess mortality is to the tune of 28 per 1,000, right? Very significant. And in fact, the Travancore famine led to an extraordinary migration in South India, the contours of which we can only very dimly glimpse as yet. There are reports from places all over, like Chettinad, saying that there are refugees from Travancore who have come, we have to open these soup kitchens, we have to start feeding people. A huge lot of people migrated from Travancore to the sort of Malayalam-speaking districts of the Madras province itself. And about 15,000 of them died en route, trying to sort of reach those areas. So it was an extraordinary sort of situation of deprivation across India. And this was recognized. This is a letter written by the Secretary of the Civil Defense Department, who says that inflation is at present a greater danger to India than either the Germans or the Japanese, right? The very senior official of the government of India, an ICS officer presumably, who says this. Anyway, while all of this stuff is happening, you're learning to cope with this stuff. India also has a war to fight. And that war requires a variety of preparation on the part of India in order to sort of get things going. So, the first thing which has to happen is that the Indian army has to be reorganized, actually reorganized again. Because when the pre-war Indian army, which was 200,000 in size, was expanded and sent to fight in places like North and East Africa, it was basically a policing constabulary force of certain kind, right? So the Indian army always had three sets of duties. The first was external imperial duties, which always a very small part because you didn't do that all of the time. The second was to police the Northwest Frontier Province, which is now with Pakistan. And the third was internal policing, right? So riot control, various kinds of small-scale insurgencies and such like things. And all of this meant that the Indian army basically became a well-equipped constabulary force, a policing force of a certain kind, not really a modern war-fighting military organization of anything. But that has to be changed because when you went to fight in North and East Africa, you were basically fighting mechanized war. So the Indian army had to be given trucks, it had to be given tanks. And in fact, one of the major attractions of recruitment to the Indian army used to be that you could actually handle this gadgetry, right? So the when recruitment teams used to go into the countryside, they would tell people that, listen, we'll teach you how to ride a track or a half track or a tank. And tomorrow when you come back, you can actually know how to ride a tractor, right? So that was the way that you would attract people to come into the army. So you did this whole mechanization of the army, got it up to speed. That army then, gave a knockout punch to Erwin Rommel, the famous desert fox in North Africa, did all kinds of things in Italy subsequently. But against the Japanese, this entire organization had to be changed once again. In effect, the Indian army had to be demechanized because you were now fighting in the jungles of Burma, where all of this stuff was actually a liability. Having tracks, half tracks, tanks, none of that stuff was of any use. Your entire sort of organization of the army and the supply chains, the logistic chains, had to be overturned once again. So you had to move from being a mechanized army into one which is light infantry, where people can carry stuff on their backs, move light, move off the main roads and tracks, which is what the Japanese were constantly doing. You got rid of a lot of animal transport when you got mechanized, right? So mules and other units which the Army Supply Corps used to organize, all of that had been thrown overboard. Now all of those units had to be brought back in. You had to get certain other kinds of animal transport like elephants, right? Because you're talking about crossing very big rivers, building ersatz bridges across Burma and so on. Now, the use of elephants in warfare in South Asia has a very long history. In fact, Thomas Troutman has written a very interesting book on the elephant in this part of the world and its role in war fighting. And it's interesting to note that Mountbatten's 14th Army was the last instance of the elephant being used in active combat in South Asia, right? And it happened in 1944-45 in Burma. Okay. The next thing you had to do was to attend to the health of the Indian soldier, right? The Indian soldier had to be recruited on certain parameters of height, weight, and other kinds of qualifications. This chart tells you what were the sort of acceptable recruitment standards for various categories of Indian soldiers. And I've deliberately picked Sikh and Punjabi Muslims with Marathas and Madras so that A, you have a geographic spread, and B, you have a spread of certain martial classes and certain non-martial classes, right? So if you see, this chart tells you what is the average height and weight of the Indian soldier had to be when he was recruited into the Indian Army. By 1941, these standards are very steadily dropping, right? By 1942, it's dropping even further. Just take a look. By 1942, the average Sikh soldier who is coming in and the Indian Army is taking in has to weigh only 105 pounds as opposed to 120 pounds on his counterpart there. And the army statistics tell you that the actual figures of people who are coming in were at least another 15-20 pounds lesser, right? So they were already, this is the baseline standards, but being very significantly diluted. And this is happening because of that story of deprivation across India that we saw about. Yeah, so the Indian Army is recruiting from the same countryside in India, which has been hit very hard by wartime inflation and scarcity. And it is reflected in the sort of statistics of the Indian soldier most clearly. So what you had to do, therefore, was not only to accept people would come in weaker physically, but you had to scale them up very quickly to be able to fight a major opponent like the Japanese, right? And some progress is made by 1944 because you're starting to sort of get better people, but the Indian Army has to do a lot more. So during this period, the Indian Armed Forces and various sort of scientific establishments, the CSIR, the Center for, CSIR is created during the Second World War in order to do industrial and scientific research for the war effort. That is the origins of the CSIR. And the CSIR actually starts doing a lot of nutritional testing across India on various categories of Indian soldiers to see how is it that we can get these men to sort of put on weight very quickly, right? So after a lot of trial and testing for about 18 months or so, you come up with a figure like saying the average Indian soldier needs about 2,800 calories of food per day, right? Most of them are getting about less than 500 before they came into the army. So once again, one of the reasons for coming to the army is food, because availability of food is a huge thing, right? And it's not something to be sort of trivialized. But there is another problem, which is that for people who are not used to eating anything at all, suddenly to start feeding them 5 times the amount of calorie intake means that their bodies cannot take that stuff, right? There is also another cultural problem, which is that most Indian soldiers, just like most Indians back in the day, and I'm sure some of you in the audience will sort of bear me out, used to predominantly eat only 2 meals a day. You would have one meal at around 10 o'clock and another meal around 6 o'clock. So if you are trying to give an Indian soldier 2,800 calories in 2 meals, his system is starting to revolt, right? It just cannot cope with that kind of calorie intake. So you have to convince them to start having 4 meals a day. You start with tea and shakarpara in the morning, you have another breakfast kind of a thing, you have lunch, and then evening thing. Now, culturally, it's a practice which the Indian soldier found very difficult to adjust to. How do you sort of get used to the idea that the first thing you do on getting up in the morning is actually have a cup of tea? Sounds very normal to us these days, but it was not at all normal back then, right? So these were the kinds of very nitty-gritty nut and bolt problems that had to be solved in order to get the Indian soldier to be in fighting trim to take on the Japanese. There was, of course, more to be done. You had to build what historians call the sinews of power, right? The material basis of military power projection had to be created. This meant you had to, first of all, construct airfields. If you want to take on an opponent like the Japanese in Burma, you had to first achieve air superiority. The Indian and the Allied air forces had to make sure that they could fight every Japanese plane off the skies. That meant you needed a lot of airfields in Northeast India, right? So the construction of airfields goes up from about 1516 in 1942 to 231 by the time. Extraordinary amount of military labor involved in these things. You have to construct huge amounts of reserve-based depots, basically logistic storage areas in central and southern India, including places like Abadi came up during the Second World War, partly because there was not just the Indian army which was increasing in size, but many other allied soldiers from Africa, from America, who were coming and fighting in India, right? So huge amounts of construction work had to happen for this. You had to reconstruct ports, some of which, particularly in eastern India, had been destroyed by Japanese bombing. That include ports like Vizag, Calcutta, right? Very important ports. And unfortunately, in 1944, there was a massive explosion in the Bombay port, which meant that the Bombay port was actually out of action for about 3 months. It was an explosion which was apparently heard in places which are at least 100, 150 kilometers away from Bangalore. A huge, because they just parked a lot of ships with various kinds of ammunitions in very close proximity, and that stuff just blew up, right? Now, the kinds of problems that had to be solved on the logistic stuff are very interesting, and I think also tell you about the kinds of things that people had to think about in terms of fighting. And the story of the B&AR, or the Bengal and Assam Railway, is actually a very interesting one, right? So the Bengal and Assam Railway was crucial to the war effort because it connected Calcutta with Assam, right? That was the last stretch. Most of the Indian soldiers were deployed close to Burma. So you had to sort of send people there, you had to keep them supplied day in, day out, right on the borders with Burma. And the Bengal and Assam Railway had a stretch which was just starting north of Calcutta, going up to the easternmost tip of Assam, which was about 800 miles in length. And that was a logistical nightmare of a very different kind, partly because of certain kinds of technical decisions taken by the government of India in its own wisdom back in the day. Indian railways back then used to have 4 different kinds of gauges, right? So the universal gauge is actually the meter gauge. But in India, even today, if you notice, most of the stuff is broad gauge, right? And the British decided to go for the broad gauge in late 19th century because they thought they could attract more capital. It just made financial sense. But technically, it was a nightmare because you had a meter gauge and you had a broad gauge, right? And then you had 2 different kinds of narrow gauges which used to operate in the mountains. All of these were there in that 800 kilometer stretch. And think about the problem, first of all, of loading a train, running on meter gauge up to a certain point, changing into broad gauge wagons, right? The wagon sizes are different. You have to unload and reload all over again. And then you reach a point where you have to cross the Brahmaputra, which is the widest river, which does not have a bridge at that point of time. So the river crossing happens on a ferry. And then you get onto the other side and there are 2 meter gauges to navigate before you can deposit stuff to the troops, right? So which means that the logistical challenge is extraordinary. So if you look at this, in May 1942, this was before things really started getting active, the capacity of the B&AR in this stretch was about 600 tons per day is what they could carry. What you needed was about 900 tons. By June 1943, when all this airfield construction, etc., is happening, you have to move all of the material. You're talking about capacities about 1,700 tons, and what you need is about 4,300 a day, right? Huge amounts of shortfalls day in and day out. And by this time, the Americans are very heavily involved in the war effort in India. And they come to the conclusion that Auchinleck, who was the commander-in-chief of India, senior-most military officer, They said, is overwhelmed with the magnitude of this problem of moving the insignificant amount of 3,400 tons a day, right? So United States of America, right? You're the most technologically advanced military power on the planet. And the Americans are just amazed at the sheer inefficiency of the British Raj, right? They come around, they take a look, they say, what is happening, right? People are moving the capital from Delhi to Simla for the summer, winter. I mean, like, how can this kind of inefficient behavior happen during wartime? And all of this seemed to be personified. So actually what happened in 1943 was something very interesting. The Americans literally took over the Bengal and Assam Railway. 2 battalions of the American Army, US Army Railroad, were inducted into India. And those guys practically ran these trains using Indian engine drivers and technicians and everything. So, they took control of what was actually a private company in India at that point of time, right? And by March 1944, when, March 1944 is an important date because that's when the Japanese attack eastern India, and that attack fails, and then the Indians go into Burma, right? You see that the capacity kind of is starting to move. So here you have a chart which tells you what is the increase in the amount of tons per day which were being shifted in the BNAR. And you see that from about February 1944 onwards, there is a steady increase in the amount of stuff that you're able to move. Why is this happening? Because the Americans bring in a completely different system of inventory management, of loading and unloading stuff, of using and operating a waterborne system of ferries, right, which they also partially automate, so that, and they're constantly thinking about saying, how much more can a train carry? If we add another engine to it, is it going to be able to carry more? How are we going to reduce turnaround time in these very small stations in some corner of Assam, right? All of those kinds of very technical logistical problems, the Americans really brought a degree of ingenuity to it, which is why you see this extreme sort of significant improvement in what is happening. And by October 1944, the requirements and the ability to sort of supply are more or less matching, right? And that date is quite significant because it is in February 1944 onwards that the military part of the story really starts to change. In March 1944, the Japanese decide that they want to take one last shot at invading eastern India in order to force the British Raj to sort of capitulate. That attack does not go very well, and very quickly, as part of an unplanned move really, the Indian Army and other allied forces move into Burma, right? And the Burma campaign goes on until August 1945, at which point of time, because of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese decide to call for a surrender. So by the time the Japanese surrender, the Indian Army is actually in Rangoon and is looking to move south, right? So this logistical effort in some ways was absolutely timely. If it had been delayed even by 6 more months, you simply could not have fought a campaign like that. And that is kind of important to remember, that the sinews of power mattered a lot during this period. So what happens after you have won the war? Well, the first thing is that India, because of its very important contribution to the war effort, is called in at the time of the creation of the post-war international order, right? The San Francisco Conference, which creates the United Nations. India is the only non-independent territory which is called in as a founding member. More importantly, India is present at the creation of both the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which were created in this conference at Bretton Woods in 1944. Right? Why is India called to the Bretton Woods Conference? Because of its extraordinary economic contribution, financial contribution to the war. 1.3 billion pounds in sterling balances is what India was owed by Britain at the end of the war. And in fact, because of India's sort of very large contribution, India even managed to get one of the 6 permanent directorships in the IMF, which we hold even till date, right? So Indians do not have to sort of compete for any time there is an election of a director and so on. So the importance given to a country which was not even independent at this point of time is a marker of India's arrival on the world stage. And that was catalyzed by its role in the Second World War. And here you have Jawaharlal Nehru, who had taken over as the vice president of the Viceroy's Executive Council during the interim government in September 1946. He was effectively the de facto prime minister of an interim government ahead of, about a year ahead of independence. And within 2 days of taking over, Jawaharlal Nehru, who also is the foreign minister, controls the Ministry of External Affairs, writes this in a note. He says, whatever the present position of India might be, she is potentially a great power. Right? So already you have this kind of a recognition. Undoubtedly, India will have to play a very great part in the security problems of Asia and Indian Ocean, especially of the Middle East and Southeast Asia. India is the pivot around which these problems will have to be considered. It is the center of security in Asia. Now, this is not some abstract sort of dreamy notion set out by a man who's otherwise termed to be an idealist. Think about it. September 1946. Japan is prostrate after the defeat of the war. China is still enmeshed in a major civil war. And India is the other major Asian power which has contributed enormously to the war and is on the road to freedom. So in a sense, the assumption that people like Jawaharlal Nehru had about India's role, if you go back, fits in very well with the old empire of the Raj kind of framework, right? Which is that India had a natural zone of influence in which it had to pull its weight. And even nationalists who were ready to see the back of the mandarins of the British Raj bought into that sort of a picture. But there was a small problem in Jawaharlal Nehru's vision, and the reason why it could not be quite realized in the way that he assumed it would be in 1946. And that was that freedom, when it came to India, came with partition, right? The creation of Pakistan, in many ways, cut off India's links with much of the western region in which India's power used to be projected, right? Whether it was Afghanistan, whether it was the Gulf states, which used to be indirectly ruled by India. Yeah, so the Gulf states, Bahrain, Kuwait, etc., had a relationship with India, which was something akin to the relations that the princely states used to have. So we used to have Indian sort of representatives who used to practically advise the local rulers about what needed to be done and so on, right? All of that kind of influence became extremely difficult for India to project into West Asia once your overland contiguity was broken up with the creation of Pakistan. The second thing was that the British decided to let go of Burma. Now, we don't think about it this way, but Burma was actually separated from British India only in 1937, right? So in effect, the creation of a separate, directly governed colony of Burma away from New Delhi was the first partition of India. The second partition happens only in 1947, right? And the first partition created Burma as a separate entity, but the Second World War really ravaged Burma. Here you have a photo of the oil fields in Burma, which were set alight by troops of the Indian Army when they were being asked to pull out of Burma, right? I mean, the Burmese sort of territory was completely laid to waste when the Indian Army was pulling out. And subsequently, when the Japanese pulled out, they did the same, right? So Burma basically got caught in two major waves of fighting. And after the war, the Burmese, it's difficult to think of it this way, but in the 1930s, Burma was the largest rice exporting country of any country in the world, right? And that country was completely devastated by the Second World War. And after that, it got caught up in a range of internal problems, and the Burmese effectively chose to isolate themselves from the rest of the world, right? And what it meant really was that cumulatively, the creation of Pakistan on the west and this sort of inward turn of Burma on the east meant that you could neither project your power in the old way in West Asia, nor could you do the same in Southeast Asia, right? So in effect, the sort of multiple partitions of the subcontinent, along with the effects of the Second World War, meant that things could not be the same as Jawaharlal Nehru had hoped. Nevertheless, there were important consequences. And I want to close by talking a bit about the legacy of the Second World War. The first, of course, is the creation of a very large standing professional military. The Indian Army came down from about 2.5 million to 800,000 a year after the war had ended. And that is approximately the number where it has stayed ever since. The social composition of the Indian Army, which was not just restricted to the martial races, but also to various other communities and groups, was in fact expanded during in independent India, right? Which is why you have this highly nationalized Indian Army, which recruits from all parts of India and so on. A direct legacy of the Second World War. You developed military infrastructure of a kind that you simply did not have. The only military infrastructure that you had, storage depots, etc., were all in places like Rawalpindi in Pakistan, because the British always assumed that Afghanistan was the place where you end up fighting a war. Now, because the Japanese attacked Burma and came so close to India, you ended up creating a lot of military infrastructure in southern and eastern India, right? So think about it this way: if the Japanese had not attacked India, Pakistan might have ended up with better military infrastructure than India, right? So we have something to thank the Japanese for. You have an expanded industrial base, which was kind of, again, a few direct consequence, as we saw, of wartime activities and the kind of role that the private sector was called on to play. You had the beginnings of state-led planned industrialization, right? So one of the great myths about India's history in the first 15, 17 years after independence is that somehow Jawaharlal Nehru was very attracted by the Soviet model and foisted this idea of a planned economy in India. Completely incorrect. The idea of a planned economy actually comes from the Second World War. That is the first time that the government of India decides or understands that it has to plan the economy, right? The whole basic models of input, output, etc., all started during the Second World War. Much of the legal framework which underpinned the planned economy in the 50s also came out as a consequence of the Second World War itself. India's international presence, I've already talked about its role in the sort of United Nations, Bretton Woods, and all of, subsequently in various kinds of third world groupings, etc., again began as a consequence of its role in the Second World War. And finally, and here I come back to the point with which I began, when we are thinking about India's sort of emergence as a major actor on the world stage, we have to think about it as a long transformation. It is not something that has happened in the last 25 years. As we see the first, basic sort of material basis of power and influence and how you project them, all of those really came to the fore in the Second World War. And here you have a cover of the Economist magazine from last year, which shows Prime Minister Modi sitting on top of the elephant, which is Indian economy, with a jet engine, sort of aircraft engine strapped onto it, right? Saying the Indian economy is going to sort of take off. So as we contemplate such happy possibilities, it's useful to remember that all of this began at a time when elephants were actually pulling aircraft along. Thank you.
I just recently finished reading up Sanjeev Sanyal's book, The Churn of the Indian Ocean. And I think he makes a very good case for actually looking at an Indic or Asian view of our own history. I mean, of course, the period you're talking about is actually more European. How would you reconcile that with what we still have a very Eurocentric or British-centric view of our history, given that there's a huge, background to our history? The second thing is how are we going to actually be a superpower when we can't protect our own people, be it Christians or Hindus or other minorities in our surrounding nations and within our country's border? Isn't that actually an important issue for us to even of course from the point of view of peace and economics?
I asked this question in the context of two developments. One, of course, is the revolt to the ratings of the Royal Indian Navy in Bombay. And the second one, when the British Indian forces were sent to East Indies to take the surrender from Japan, they came into conflict with the Republican Army. And sections of the Indian Army revolted against and joined the Republican forces. So in these two remarkable developments, in the background of this, do you consider it to be a disciplined organization? Are there any other signs of indiscipline that you find?
To come to your point, sir, which is about the, this thing. Of course, the most significant and possibly the best known instance of whatever, whether you want to call it indiscipline or not is a matter of terminology, is that of the Indian National Army, right? When about 25,000 prisoners of war who were captured in Malaya and in Singapore ended up joining the Indian National Army, which was raised first by the Japanese and subsequently taken over by Subhash Chandra Bose. And the RIN mutiny, which you talk about, is at the end of the war, and the other two incidents. All of these are related issues, right? And in the first place, it's worth sort of pointing out that the British themselves were quite concerned about this stuff. In 1943, when the Indian Army was at the peak of, recruitment expansion, when daily numbers were sort of going up, none less than Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister at that point of time, pointed out in a minute that we are creating an army which can shoot us in our back someday. Why are we doing this? Why do we need such a big Indian army? Keep it small, right? So the concern that the old Indian army, which was composed of the martial races, groups whose loyalties you had cultivated over several generations, take a place like Punjab, right? You built like canal families for them, you gave them land grants, you sort of created networks of welfare which continued for generations. That is how you ensured their loyalty. But you couldn't do that, obviously, when recruitment is expanding. Even more concerned about the coming in of the new officers, right, whose numbers also increased. And many of these officers were people who were students. It was their classmates who ended up fighting in, revolting in Quit India movement of 1942. So how much difference is there, right? So there was this overarching concern. But at the same time, I think it's worth pointing out that both these phenomena of 2.5 million people sort of joining up and 25,000 defecting to the Japanese are more or less two sides of the same coin, because both these sets of people believed that their actions would contribute to the independence of India, which is paradoxical. It's very difficult to think about it that way. It is not at all the case that people who joined the Indian Army thought that they were there to uphold the sort of longevity of the British Raj. Many of them joined for very prosaic reasons. They needed a job, they needed food, they needed some kind of post-war opportunities for employment, all of which the army promised. And those who were more politically aware amongst the soldiers, and there were quite a few, all of them said that, we are joining the army. In fact, there's a very interesting letter written by a soldier from the Garhwal regiment, which is now in Uttarakhand, to his company commander. He says that Mahatma Gandhi says that all Indians are equal, or all human beings are equal. So why does the British soldier Tommy get paid 9 rupees a day when I get a few annas? Right? So that sort of political consciousness is there. And I think that's the important point to remember, even about those who are ostensibly collaborating with the British Raj, so to speak. On the last question, I'm sorry, I've not read Sanjeev's book yet. I'll get around to it. About, yes, what should be done in order to protect. I think that, those kinds of actions are only larger, are a subset of a problem of how do you, project power, create influence in various regions and so on. And I think it's not just about protection of minorities in this and that country, right? I mean, if you take the case of something like Bangladesh, which is there, even though, obviously when the Pakistan army cracked down, there was a very large number of Hindus who were part of the influx. But ultimately, the Indian army had to go in because instability in those regions meant that it will have negative effects on India, right? In a matter of 10 weeks, some 10 million people landed up in India. Just think of it in the scale of the European refugee crisis today, right? These advanced, well-developed economies can't cope with a few 100,000 refugees coming into their shores. How could a country like India do? So then you had to take action. So those kinds of possibilities exist forever, right? In a sense that how do you provide stability and security to your wider region? And I don't think that has got anything to do with any particular community. They may be majorities, minorities in various countries. The problem is one of instability and how you cope with it.
Sir, my name is Ganesh. I'm a lecturer in media. I would like to ask you a question about the role of private sector during the Second World War. Did we have a war industry at that time? Was it well developed, or we had to borrow the weapons from outside or outside countries? What was the policies that were prevalent at that time? So what do you think about the role of the private sector, and what about the government industry? And you said about the Nehru's policy of following the Russian model. So is there any other alternative to that? So can you just, thank you.
I'm Varadarajan from Madras Chamber of Commerce. The Second World War was declared by Britain. Did they realize at that time that it will continue for 5-6 years, or even the terminology Second World War, when was it coined? Immediately after the war or the end of it? Because that, I think the length had an effect on the whole thing.
Yeah, so let me answer your question first, sir. I think the term the Second World War was coined well before the Second World War ever began, because after the First World War, people were thinking a Second World War was going to come about, right? In fact, I teach classes on international history of the 20th century. One of the things I tell my students is that people were calling the First World War even as the war was being fought, right? Because there was this premonition that this is going to be a century of wars. And so in that sense, but you're right. Nobody expected, certainly in the context of British India, nobody expected that India would have to end up playing this kind of an important role, partly because you did not think that India's commitments in the Middle East and North Africa would be quite as high. And you more or less discounted the fact that the Japanese would be able to do it, right? Part of it was strategic calculation or miscalculation. Part of it was also racial assumption. The troops which were sent to Malaya and Burma in 1940-41 were the rawest of the recruits of the Indian Army. The most newly raised units were sent there because they thought that it's the Japanese, we can take care of them, right? Which proved to be a completely wrong assumption, right? So in a sense, a combination of various kinds of ideological and strategic miscalculations which led to that, and nobody quite anticipated that question. The second problem, sir, about your question on private industry, yes, there was, as I said, wartime production began, and of course you created a lot of government-led factories, but also private factories, right? And I think, say, if you take the example of someone like Walchand Hirachand, who was an Indian industrialist at that point of time, Walchand Hirachand actually, convinced the government of India to allow him to set up an aircraft factory in India in order to supply military aircraft. And in fact, his aircraft factory, which was set up in Bangalore, was the land was given by the Maharaja of Mysore and capital was also given by them. And the Indian army agreed that they would place some orders for this thing. And Walchand Hirachand actually had a joint venture with an American aircraft company. And his assembly line was rolling out stuff by 1942 when the Japanese attack came and the government took over that factory. Walchand Hirachand had registered that factory as Hindustan Aircraft Limited. It survives today as Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, as the largest defense public sector undertaking in Government of India, right? So it's very interesting that India's defense industrial base actually has its origins as much in private sector as in public sector. So today when we're talking about debates about privatization of defense industrial base, it's useful to sort of recall that. At the same time, Walchand was also, set up the first sort of private shipyard in Vizag. Again, a project which had to be aborted because of the Japanese attacks. The third thing which a lot of Indians tried to do but never really kicked off was to manufacture cars and various other kinds of automobiles, because these were again kinds of things for which there was wartime requirement. So Walchand, in fact, registered a company called Premier Automobiles, which did not roll out any cars during the war. But after the war, he had a joint venture with Fiat in Italy. And they, later on came up with a very popular model in the 1960s called the Premier Padmini. And similarly, the Birlas, G.D. Birla started, another company which subsequently tied up with Morris and as Hindustan Motors later on rolled out the Ambassador cars. So all of these were projects which had their origins in Second World War. So.
Can you give us a realistic perspective on India's position today as an Asian power or a rising world power in both economics and military might, particularly vis-a-vis Pakistan, our neighbor, and China on the northern side?
Well,
Men and machinery.
Sure. I don't, I think when it comes to Pakistan, your fundamental factor which comes into the balance is nuclear weapons, right? Otherwise, in every conventional metric, India is much stronger than Pakistan. So I don't think Pakistan is really an issue that needs to sort of absorb our energies very much in that direction. As far as China and others are concerned, China is obviously, in terms of every index of economic military power, they are way well ahead of us. But at the same time, I think, there are certain kinds of advantages that we enjoy over them at this point of time, which, we have to either ensure the perpetuation of those kinds of advantages or to prevent the Chinese from sort of neutralizing those. Like, say, for instance, in the maritime domain, the Indian Navy definitely has greater operational capabilities in the Indian Ocean region than the Chinese have, partly because of your position, partly because of the kinds of capabilities that you have, partly because of the fact that the Chinese PLA Navy is caught up in East China Sea, South China Sea, and various things, right? So we do have a bit of a lead there. Military technology is changing very quickly. So what seems as a threat can also become an opportunity, right? So in India, people get very worried about, Chinese are building ports in Gwadar, they are docking a submarine in Sri Lanka, they are doing something in Bangladesh, right? But all of these places are within reach of your ballistic missile systems today, right? So in effect, if the Chinese want to sort of overextend themselves in your neighborhood, we should say, be our guest, right? It gives us some this thing. So I think while the overall balance is very strongly tilted in their direction, just like in the India-Pakistan case, Pakistan has certain kinds of advantage. We also have the question is how you play the chips from here on.
Yeah, we'll take the last two questions. Yes.
Hi, sir. My question is that how has the World War II helped in the creation of the Indian diaspora, especially in terms of cultural exchange?
So the Indian diaspora, we actually had very interesting consequences for the diaspora because, as I said, the diaspora was very large, had shifting sort of the sheer numbers of it. But during the Second World War, there were parts of the diaspora which had very traumatic experiences, particularly in Burma. And of course, there were a lot of people from this part of India who were affected, who were forced to leave Burma. Some 300,000-400,000 of them might have had to sort of outward migration from Burma. When they went back, the Burmese government, which was then independent, was not willing to sort of allow them to hold on to their assets and so on. So it became a protracted thing. Also, the other thing which happened was that the new government of India, which is the independent government of India under Jawaharlal Nehru, also took a different view of what its relationship with the so-called diaspora should be, which was quite different from, say, what the British government had. Because under Britain, it was all under one imperial structure, right? So the way you dealt with people of Indian origin, say, in South Africa, etc., could be quite different. But under the independent India, the government kind of took a very different kind of a role. And in many ways, it's it's only more recently that we have started reactivating our links with the diaspora, partly because now we operate in a global economy and various things. So the last question about the sterling balances, very important. Yes, India did get the sterling balances back. The last tranche of the sterling balances was paid out to India in 1956, right? So it took about a good 10 years after the war to happen. But the problem was that both in the way in which the sterling balances were paid back to us and the manner in which we were able to use the sterling balances was nothing like what Indians had assumed at that point of time. So if you go back to 1944, right, there are Indians of all kinds, capitalists, others, who are thinking about the sterling balances question is very heavily weighing on their minds. Because see, what you have is really 1.3 billion pounds which you can take from Britain and use it to buy various kinds of goods for post-war reconstruction, development of the Indian economy and such like things. So if you look at the Bombay Plan, the iconic sort of 1944 document, a chunk of the financing of the plan was actually expected to come from the sterling balances. That was partly the reason why people were making those plans. People like G.D. Birla, Purushottam Das, Thakur Das, all of them felt that Britain will actually renege on the sterling balances, which is not such a inconceivable proposition, given that that is exactly what the British government did after the First World War. They didn't owe us this sums of money, but they effectively said, sorry, it's not coming back to you, or if it's coming back because of depreciation of the pound, the value is kind of written off. So the best assessment, and the pound was depreciated again in 1949, and Britain continued, the best assessment is by a Brazilian economist called Marcelo Abreu, who estimates that some 30% of the original value of the sterling balances were already sort of written off, even though we got the nominal sum back, right? The second thing was, because it was paid out in all these dribs and drabs, the sterling balances never fit in with your framework of the planned economy, right? Which is why it's very striking, right? India is such a country which has so much of foreign exchange reserves. The last tranche of it is repaid to you in 1956. 1957, you have the first foreign exchange crisis already on your hands, right? So it's in essence, even though you got it back, so there is no case to be made that Britain should be sort of paying reparations like what Shashi Tharoor suggests. So there's no case for reparations, but the fact is that you didn't get it back in a way that was useful to you in any serious way.